starting to record, and I'm going to work on getting us onto the Facebook, and then I'll let you know when we are live, and also when I hit broadcast to let attendees in.
You want me to start at like?
Sorry.
You want me to start a little after 5, or we start right at 5?
I would say like just like a minute or two after. Just like you should be able to see people coming in to the room. So I would just kind of welcome people in. Terry's very much like, we're gonna start right exactly on time. I usually will give it like just a minute to let people kind of
get in. How many are we expecting, or how many people registered?
Let me see.
Yeah, this is a great question. I feel like I want to know this too, and I have no idea.
Yeah, I know. I haven't.
Hopefully, just a couple.
Checked it in.
Don't have to introduce or embarrass myself in front of too many people.
30 people. It's gonna go great.
Let's see here. Put up my report.
While Lee's looking that up, I just want to say I'm really happy you're all here. I'm kind of nervous to moderate this amazing panel, but I'm just so thankful that everyone's down to be a part of it.
It'll be casual. It'll be great. Okay, let's see. We should be having, we're in August. It looks like I've got 53 RSVPs, so.
Nice.
Pretty nice.
So we're outnumbered.
We're outnumbered. What's safe is that none of them can actually interact with you other than chatting.
That's coming in Zoom 3.0 or whatever.
There you go. All right, I'm gonna hit live on Facebook and get us going here. So I'm gonna take my video off, and then I'll just like give Kelsey. I'll give you the okay to start. So let me just set this up here. This is one of the reasons why I want to set up a new live streaming platform so that I can actually have a better idea of like, go. Okay.
I have to admit, I was waiting to see who might have like their hair did for this panel. So, Crew and Claire and Kelsey. I mean, I don't know. Maybe everyone did. It's just easier when the hair is long.
All right. So we are now streaming live on Facebook, and I'm going to hit broadcast to let attendees in right now. All right, we're getting folks in.
I appreciate your lighting setup, Crew.
Okay. Hi, everyone. We want to welcome you to No More Silence, Digital Community Histories of HIV/AIDS. I think people are just joining now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This event is hosted by the GLBT Historical Society and the UCSF Archives. My name is Kelsey Evans, pronouns she, her, and I'm the Director of Archives and Special Collections at the GLBT Historical Society. I'm just going to introduce tonight's event, and then I'll hand things off to our moderator, Charlie McQuarrie. So I first want to take a moment to acknowledge that the GLBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land. And I invite folks with us today to acknowledge to themselves or in the chat their local tribal communities as we recognize and honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous people. Thank you. Also, I want to thank Lee Pfeffer, who is our museum operations manager, for putting this event together in collaboration with UCSF. Today's event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and on our website. Many people are watching the live stream on Facebook, and we welcome you all. Please note that while we will try to monitor your comments on Facebook, our panel will not see comments and questions there. If you're watching us via Zoom, we welcome your active participation in the forum. We encourage you to post questions for the moderator or panelists in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and post any comments in the chat box. And make sure you mark all panelists and attendees for the comments to be public. So just a little bit about the GLBT Historical Society. We were founded in 1985 and were recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites, the GLBT Historical Society Museum located in the Castro, and the Dr. John P. Pacheco Archives and Special Collections in the Mid-Market District. And although our physical locations are currently closed due to the ongoing pandemic, we encourage everyone to check out our growing array of online exhibitions, events, and archival resources at glbthistory.org. And finally, I want to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible. If you're not already a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society, please consider joining today. There are a variety of wonderful perks. We also encourage everyone to join us for our upcoming virtual gala on October 16th, which is going to be a really fun way to support us. So now on to tonight's event. I'm going to pass it over to Charlie, who will introduce himself and tonight's panelists. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I do just want to check. I'm happy to keep rolling, but do you want to say anything about GLBT archives specifically, Kelsey?
Sure. So I can, do you want me to go into the script portion?
Maybe if you could just explain the script portion of how UCSF and GLBT started working together and why we started digitizing materials together.
Sure. So yeah, I have a little bit of background on why UCSF and GLBT Historical Society came together to collaborate on this project. It goes back into the 1980s, beginning in the 1980s, during the AIDS epidemic. Archival repositories, including GLBT Historical Society, UCSF Archives, and the San Francisco Public Library, began documenting the epidemic. Each institution built archival collections that documented activism, personal stories, research, and care related to AIDS. Due to the nature of the quickly evolving epidemic, which is something that I think feels particularly relatable in today's circumstances, the grassroots organization's papers, activist records, and research files were often split and collected by a number of different institutions. This resulted in a wealth of documentation, but presented researchers with a sometimes challenging landscape in which to conduct research, with sources being so divided amongst institutions. So to help facilitate access and research, in 2017, UCSF, SFPL, and GLBT Historical Society designed a project to digitize early AIDS-related material from each institution and make the content freely and publicly available on a shared digital hub, a space that would serve to virtually connect and reunite these collections. We were awarded an implementation grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities of over $300,000 to help support the work, and UC Merced joined the project to serve as the digitization partner, using their state-of-the-art digitization lab to scan material at scale. The 24-month project resulted in over 120,000 pages of material being scanned from over 40 collections from the 3 institutions. The digital collections were made freely and publicly available on calisphere.org, which is a major digital hub for digitized collections in California, and on the Digital Public Library of America. Each repository also made their content available through their digital collections on their own websites. So this digitized content is what forms the base source set for the No More Silence Digital Humanities project. We're excited that this subsequent grant pushes the boundaries of what's possible with digitized archival content. I think the material for the NEH grant was scanned with the goal of facilitating public access and allowing the materials from the different institutions to speak to each other in new ways. And the work and tools that No More Silence is fostering really show that next step, how digitized content can create opportunities for digital humanities innovation and new research. I know at GLBT Historical Society, we're excited to continue this relationship with UCSF and SFPL as we all expand our digital collections and online offerings. At the Historical Society, this age-related content has been used to create online exhibits, expand our digital collections, and we've built educational resources, including research guides and primary source sets of curated digitized content for use by students, educators, and lifelong learners. We're looking forward to seeing the projects that come out of these upcoming workshops following today's talk. There are all kinds of opportunities for learning from these methodologies and applying them to any number of historical subject areas represented in our other digital collections. Especially during this pandemic, as we work to find new ways to get researchers the materials they need remotely, we encourage creative approaches to digitize content, and we're certainly prioritizing building new digital collections and making material available online for folks to use through glbthistory.org. I encourage everyone here today to check out our newly redesigned online resources page on our website. It features our ever-growing digital collections with thousands of items related to queer history and our online exhibits and educational resources. So with that, I think, Charlie, now you can give a little bit more intro to what the panel is about and what No More Silence is really about.
Thanks so much, Kelsey, for getting us started thinking about digital access to these archival materials, because that's what all these panelists have such incredible words to speak to on that. I want to say a few thanks too before I jump super deep into this. I just want to thank Lee and Kelsey and Mark Sawchuk and everyone else at GLBT Historical Society who has helped make this event possible. And I also want to thank Joanna Kang, Rebecca Tang, David Craw, Polina Ilieva, and Claire Kronk for all their work on the project team for this project. And for being on the panel. Thanks, Claire. And in addition, I just have to give a huge, huge shout out to our administrative assistant, Michael Foster, for making everything happen on the back end. Just want to instantiate here, like we wouldn't be anywhere without the people who are willing to just do that hard work. So thank you, Michael. And also just to introduce myself, my name is Charlie McQuarrie, and I am the digital archivist at University of California, San Francisco in the archives and special collections there. And I am also, I guess we call me the project manager for the No More Silence project, the work which has brought us here today. And on that note, and thank you for that amazing introduction, Kelsey, what is No More Silence? Why No More Silence? So in a nutshell, No More Silence is a project of UCSF Archives to take a lot of this amazing historical documentation of the early community response to HIV and AIDS that Kelsey was just talking about, and take the digitized text from all that stuff, basically kind of extract it and recompile it into, you might think of it as one big package where digital humanities researchers, computational text analysis researchers can start to ask questions across all these different archival sources at once. Can start to look at, all the lab records, all the activist organization records, all the government records, and start to ask questions like, how did different places talk about gender? How did different places talk about different treatments, things like that. So that's what we aim to do with this project. But as we continued on, we really discovered that this community outreach was a huge, huge part of this project. And in that vein, this panel, just getting people together to have this really fascinating, critical discussion, analysis of digital collecting, and especially digital collecting in the context of these really specific communities and community needs for community documentation, is also a big part of this mission. So that's why we're all here today. Before I go any further, I do need to note that this whole project on our end, UCSF end, is funded by a grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services and administered by the California State Library. And as part of that, I'm required to read the following text to you. This project was supported in part by the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services under the provisions of the Library Services and Technology Act administered in California by the state librarian. And obviously, the opinions expressed herein are not necessarily the opinions of either IMLS or the Cal State Library, but one of my opinions is that if you like this panel, you should call your representative, because the IMLS is slated for complete destruction every budgetary cycle, and it'd be really great if we could keep it around. So I wanted to voice that really quickly. I also do just want to take a moment. I'm gonna try the daring here and just share live with you a screen to show you where our digital collections can be found, the things that are a result of this project that Kelsey was just talking about. And I apologize, I need to select a different screen. So can someone maybe confirm if you're seeing calisphere.org, Kelsey? You are, great. So I just want to make sure that everyone knows, you can go to this website, calisphere.org. You can search UCSF, not SK, and we'll just do HIV. And you can find some of the amazing digitized materials that we have on here as part of this larger project. These are the documents themselves, and the data that we have compiled from all this text that you see here can be found on the website datadryad.org. This is the data repository for a lot of places, but including UCSF. And if we come to this website and just search the title of our project, No More Silence, we can find the data set itself. And if you go here, you can actually download all of the data, which is a big, long TSV file with lines and lines and lines and lines of text. So I'm not going to bog us down with that anymore, but I do think that that is a really crucial part of this project. So I wanted to take a minute to share it with folks. Okay, so now that I've said a lot of words, we're going to get started, but I do just want to take a minute to just read folks' bios, and then I'm going to jump in and actually ask people to talk a little bit more about all their work, because everyone on this panel does such amazing work. I'll just jump right in. We're starting with Claire. Claire Cronk is a PhD candidate in biomedical informatics at University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. Her research interests lie in the linguistic aspects of LGBTQIA+ data collection and their utility in biomedical research and patient-centered care. To this end, she created the Gender, Sex, and Sexual Orientation Ontology, GSSO in parentheses, a controlled vocabulary of over 10,000 LGBTQIA+ terms. She also serves on the board of the Homosaurus Project, is a member of the EMEA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, and as well as the SNOMED Mental and Behavioral Health Clinical Reference Group. And the list goes on, was recently named co-director of transgender history at Out History. Next, we have KJ Rossen. KJ is an associate professor of English and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Northeastern University. He is also the founder and director of the Digital Transgender Archive, an award-winning online repository of trans-related historical materials. And he is the co-chair of the editorial board of the Homosaurus, an international LGBTQ-linked data vocabulary. Next, we have Crew Makedo. Crew is a multimedia artist known for her work as an archivist with the Black Lesbian Archives, an ongoing archival Her Story project that aims to uplift the voices of Black lesbians and to educate, preserve, and bridge intergenerational gaps between communities. She is a cosmic rootwork astrologist at Arene Storm and is the Chief Executive Officer and CEO, Chief Executive Officer, CEO of Makedo Productions, a multimedia production company producing media and event programming that serves women's arts, community, and culture in the LGBTQ community. And next we've got Anirvan Chatterjee. Anirvan is a South Asian organizer and community historian from Berkeley, California. He co-curates the monthly Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour, which shares stories of 100 years of South Asian resistance movements in Berkeley. Anirvan spending his time in lockdown, trying to document every South Asian immigrant living in Berkeley before 1920. using only free online data sources. So far, he has identified 129 different people, including railroad workers, college students, and anti-colonial revolutionaries, the most important part. So let's jump right in. I want to stop talking a little bit, so I am going to just actually ask folks if you'll just say a little bit more about your own work. I mean, I know I introduced you, but y'all do such incredible work, and we want to hear about it. So just in the name of ease, I'll actually call on folks, and then once we get past this question, we'll move into a more fluid discussion. But I'll just call on folks so that we don't have to worry about who's going to go first. So let's start with you, Claire.
How did I know you were going to start with me? Hi, I'm Claire Kronk. I couldn't have given a better introduction myself than Charlie just gave, mostly because I wrote the introduction that Charlie just gave, which is pretty comprehensive. Essentially, I've committed the rest of my career, which is now just starting, to really increasing equity among LGBTQIA+ persons in healthcare, especially persons of color, neurodiverse people, and other intersectional groups within the healthcare space that suffer. It's a real issue because a lot of the people who construct those terminologies, those vocabularies, those environments never ask people of those identities what they want to use or what they want to be referred to as. And a lot of times this leads to horrible record keeping, miscounting, or especially in the early AIDS epidemic, a lot of problems. I mean, you had the junkie flu something like 15 years before anybody had even decided to call it AIDS. And it led to all these misinterpretations, and you have like medical misconceptions. Like, I mean, even my own parents didn't know whether or not you could get AIDS from a toilet seat. And that's problematic. And I think we're seeing a lot of that misconception, and today even like a huge amount of racism surrounding people not knowing or holding misconceptions about particular aspects of medical care. So yeah, that's what I'm about.
Thank you, Claire. Would you go next, KJ?
Sure, I'm happy to. So again, I'm KJ Rossen. I use he, him pronouns. And I'll just spend a few minutes talking about the Digital Trends Archive, which is the center of my work. It's my passion project. It is something I devote more hours to than I can quantify. But the DTA is an online, freely available collection of trans-related historical materials. And I use that kind of clunky phrase of trans-related because it doesn't just collect materials relating to people who are transgender identified, but it is much broader in scope than that. And so we collect materials related to any sorts of transgender transgressions, people who are crossing boundaries of gender, who are pushing against that, who are kind of undercutting norms of gender within their cultural context. Our collection is made up of materials that have been contributed by more than 70 different institutions, which are scattered around the world. There are institutions from 9 different countries so far who have contributed materials, and there's going to be more, especially once things get going a little more after the pandemic hopefully settles down a little bit. But yeah, so it's a freely available collection. The intent is really to help researchers to be able to find these materials much more easily than they have been able to find them in the past. In fact, GLBT Historical Society is one of our partnering institutions and has some materials available on the site that you can check out. So yeah, it's only been online for 5 years, and we are just going to keep growing. So that's all I'll say about the DTA for now.
Thank you so much, KJ. Crew, would you go next?
Most def. What's up, everybody? My name is Crew. Thank you for the intro. Once again, like Claire said, you know, I could have wrote anything better, you know what I'm saying? But to, you know, piggyback off of that, Black Lesbian Archives definitely came out of a spiritual awakening that I had, especially as I was getting to know myself as a Black lesbian. a Black woman and then a Black lesbian and what that meant for me. So it did definitely, like KJ was saying, like it kind of started off as a passion project. And then I realized, oh shit, like we might need to dig a little bit deeper into our history and, you know, the stories of where we've been and where we come from, and the input, or the, I should say the, I'm sorry, my mind just went vague, but the things that we put forth to try to push not just the Black lesbian community, but the community in general forward, you know what I mean? So for me, the Black Lesbian Archives is a way to connect ourselves to our past, to realize that like, yo, we haven't just popped up, you know, just out of nowhere, just doing what we do and just being who we are, but we actually have our elders, our wise women, our trailblazers and things who have actually come from this and were, you know, risk takers and fearful about, you know, and just standing in that truth of who they were, and still made, you know, progress forward to, you know, to pass that, but you gotta pass that torch into the next generation. So it's really just about bridging, like I said, bridging those generational gaps between us, really getting kind of like, you know, that little, what's it called, the little microscope, or, you know, into like our histories and where we've been, and really giving ourselves a sense of pride of where we come from, and knowing that we can, you know, essentially change the narrative, you know what I mean, at the end of the day. So that's a little bit about what Black Lesbian Archives is about.
This is so cruel. I know that all of y'all should be talking for like 10 times as long as you are about your work, but I guess we only have limited time. Anirvan, would you go next?
Yeah, so my parents moved from India to North America in the 1970s, and growing up in the US, like, I always kind of figured that like my history was always back in the homeland, which it is. I mean, my literal lineage. But then it wasn't until much later that I realized that like my history didn't begin the day my parents got off a plane in this country. And I didn't take any ethnic studies. I didn't have access to ethnic studies when I was growing up. So it wasn't until much later, like meeting older South Asians, and not just South Asian folks, but like South Asian activists in the community, meeting like older queer activists, really starting to like read a lot of academic history for the first time. I really kind of came to realize that we have like deep history in this country, like 400 years of history in this country. And not just history, but like resistance stories, like stories of allyship and solidarity, and really tremendous anti-colonial work. And I remember just like feeling so frustrated that like I felt like I'd been denied, like the stories of like my community that I could like step into, like the ancestors that I could pick. And so a lot of my work right now is about really building on the work of actual archives, actual like academic historians, and a lot of like information that's like trapped in archives, and doing the public history work of doing the meaning making, putting that out into the world. Right now, well, not literally right now, but when we're not under lockdown, I co-lead something called the Berkeley South Asian Radical History Walking Tour. We do a 3-hour walking tour through the city of Berkeley, California, and we tell stories of Bangladeshi gay activists and revolutionaries from the 1910s and post 9/11 like youth, like Muslim and Sikh community activism. And really, like, I think some of that work of translating like things trapped in archives into community spaces is, I think it's really important. And I feel like we're all part of like one ecosystem. We're just at different stages in that.
That's such a great, I feel like that leads really well into the next thing that I wanted to talk about. Imagine that. But one thing that I really have been so taken with in putting together this panel is the way in which I feel like for a lot of y'all as panelists, this space of archives or even just collections of documents is already an inherently political space that is meant to serve a specific community and do some pretty specific political work. And as someone who's a little bit more of like a professional archivist, that's totally not a given in the field. You know, I mean, so much of the dialogue about libraries and archives is that they're quote unquote neutral spaces. which of course is never true. So I kind of just wondered if y'all could talk a little bit about how you maybe arrived at that conception of archives and collections as a political space, or if it really, maybe it just was a given for you from the beginning. And what kind of brought you there? What was a part of that story? And maybe I'll just call on someone to start, and then we can take it out from there. Crew, I don't know. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, most def. I think the spark for me, even though I think the idea of the Black Lesbians Archive started in Williamsburg, Virginia, but I moved because I was staying with my auntie at the time, and then I moved to Chicago shortly after, and I went to this exhibit. It was like Chicago dyke spaces of like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it really changed my whole perspective of like, wow, like I went in there. First of all, shout out to Kristen Kazan and the whole team out at Reunion Chicago, because the exhibit was absolutely just amazing. It was incredible. And I looked around and I was just like, wow, like I know we've been in this mug. You know what I mean? Like I know there was more of us, more of my people, more of Black lesbians who were in the trenches as well. So I kind of, from that, it kind of sparked off like, okay, well, let's do some more research, let's do some more digging. So I got in touch with Tracy Dame, who's actually one of the co-founders of Witty City Times, who actually is one of the main editors for Chicago Reader at this time right now. And we had a couple conversations about, not necessarily what archiving is, but just the history of Chicago history. And she kind of pointed me into the direction of where I needed to go. So I say that to say, like, this wasn't something, honestly, I never thought I would be doing this work, y'all. Like, I never in my life would I have thought that I would be doing what I'm doing now. Never. Like, it was just like, it was like the universe was just putting like these steps down, and it was calling me to dig deeper within myself, and then dig deeper within the community that I was in that time, to really get a sense of self, and kind of like that inner knowing of, I know that there was other people out there that probably were looking for this information too, but either they just didn't move all the way forward with it, or, whatever reason that you have. And so I say that to say, I came into this as a storyteller. I'm still learning like the back end stuff on like actually, processing the archives and, the catalogs and, like what we going, like all the other stuff, the back end stuff. But I know how to take pieces of information. I have a Mars and Gemini. So like, I know how to take pieces of information together, really look over things, and actually be able to tell a story. So I came in of like, oh snap, well, I'm looking at this information. I can see this information. I could put it into a story. And then I realized, I'm like, we need to be the ones that are, sharing these stories with ourselves, sharing these stories with each other, sharing these stories in broader communities, so we can all kind of get a sense of where we come from. Because when you know where you come from, when you know where you've been, it's easier for you to kind of sit with that in your present. And also kind of like what we talked about before, it's easier for you to have that foundation and build into the future. So yeah, that's really where I'm at with it. Definitely.
And then I'd love if folks just want to jump in. Let's skip my calling on people at this point. You can jump in if you have anything to say.
I can jump in here too. It's interesting, I had a very different starting place than you, Crew, but I feel like we ended in similar places. I mean, for me, it was all about academic study of archives, right? I was really interested in like thinking about the archive as an object, right? In the way that cultural theorists like to do, that so often annoys archivists, right? That it's not just this like theoretical construct, but it actually is a physical location that's doing this work, right? And it's not just thinking about ideals, but really putting into practice best practices and thinking about standards and so forth. So I came to this work as a critic, as a cultural critic, and as an academic, and really admiring the pioneering legacy of some of our earliest queer archives. And starting particularly this work is galvanized in the 1980s, right? And continuing on past that point, but like really being inspired by that inherently political work of collecting history and using the argument that all archives are political for social justice aims, right? And to really push forward queer agendas. What is always interesting to me is that people will think that the Digital Trans Archive is almost beyond that in some ways, that like, of course we're political, we have transgender in the name, right? But like for me, what's interesting too, kind of picking up on some of the points that Crew is making, is that like, even within the collections that we have on our site, there's so much complexity and so much, like we're still like right in the middle of it, of where we started, right? In that, I think it's fair to say that the DTA overrepresents the more privileged factions of trans communities. And that's a problem, right? And that's in some ways the problem that we were founded to combat and to work against. But yet there's still all of these systems that come into play that continue to perpetuate those issues, right? And so there are too many white people. There's an overrepresentation of white trans experiences on the DTA. So thinking about even in collections that are responding to a political moment and are trying to do this particular work, we have so much more work to do within our collections too, and thinking about how to then address some of the existing material considerations and concerns of the fact that like there are more traces of some communities than others. And why is that? And what do those traces look like? And how do we then really work hard to try and face that and compensate for that and change our collecting policies to address that? So I think that it's kind of a historical inspiration, but also a continuing mission and a continuing push that we have to keep at the forefront of the work.
Yeah, I definitely, with both Crew and KJ, like coming into any sort of archival space, I mean, I'm connected more on the vocabulary side of things and the very like history of pathologization and medicalization. But the first time I ever kind of entered that space was when I was 14 and my 8th grade teacher went on a tirade about being behind a transsexual woman at the bank and how annoyed she was that she was late because this person, he was taking so long to change banking information. And at that point, I immediately knew, oh my gosh, that's what I am. So you go home, you furiously Google, and in a weird way, Google is itself an archive. And immediately, like you can imagine as a 14-year-old, like I'm here, I'm trying to figure things out. What come up are hundreds of thousands of Pornhub links. And at that point, you know, what does that tell you about your community? What does this tell you about your existence? You go to the local library. I grew up in a relatively rural community, and you're put under social problems. You're in the early 300s of the Dewey Decimal System. And so immediately I had conceptualized what I had as an issue, as like a serious disorder. And, you know, you shove that back down. and so now I think when we're moving into this space of discussing things, I can't tell you personally at KJ, like the Digital Transgender Archive changed my life when that became available. And, you know, it really says something when you have, as Crew said, like, you have that, you can put that history together, you can pull together those pieces, but the idea of finding those pieces and stringing them together through, you know, hundreds of code words that were used in personals ads, the little tiny scraps of Usenet that we still have, the really bad early trans forums from like 2002, like a lot of those things are almost entirely gone. Not every newspaper got microformed, not every activist letter or pamphlet got digitalized, and you're always going to be dealing with like an incomplete picture of what was, even if it was only a couple years ago. And I think, like KJ said as well, like if you're from a disenfranchised group of any kind, especially when there's intersection between those disenfranchised groups, a lot of times you really have to do a lot of work to construct a narrative. And it was so important to me and in my personal life that like I really wanted to make and facilitate that more for others, especially when it comes to demedicalizing and depathologizing how people think about themselves. You know, when somebody who's young who wants to talk about trans identity comes to see a doctor, like the doctor should be ready with the correct language, that when that kid goes home or they want to find a book about something, that they have resources like the Digital Transgender Archive to say that, oh, there were thousands of people who have tread this ground. You're not alone. And I think that's super important, and all the work that everybody on this panel does.
I'm definitely appreciating the distinction that Claire, that you made about like looking in Google as an archive, and sometimes you search and sometimes it's terrible, and then there may be some gems in the middle of it. You're like, versus things that are actually community created or community co-created, like the DTA. I think for me, like I've been on both sides of that as a like end user downstream. A lot of my research work, it's based on like census data and phone books that are like, you know, that are digitized and up on the Internet Archive, like yearbooks that are on HathiTrust. Been looking at like old prison records of I don't know if they'd be queer identified, definitely like MSM, South Asian immigrants in the 1910s who were imprisoned at San Quentin, and like finding those on old genealogy sites. And, you know, we're just like tracing lineages of queer folks in California. And, you know, some of that work, the California Digital Newspaper Collection, I mean, we discovered the first South Asian-led anti-racist protest in Berkeley through like the IMLS and NEH funded California Digital Newspaper Collection. And it's amazing just to be able to like trace a lineage of Berkeley activism that is brown, that is immigrant, that's not about white folks in the 1960s. I mean, as much as I love white folks in the 1960s, but we have multiple lineages to kind of build off of. And so much of that is about like searching against the grain. So much of that is about like making sure that things are OCR'd so we can be searching our own keywords. Just to have these access points that were never really designed for us, but we can still look through these anyway. And on the flip side, I mean, there's really great archives that we build on a lot, like the South Asian American Digital Archive based out of Philadelphia. And they're small, they're community generated, they only have 2 staff members, but they collect stories that, they collect our stories, and they try to do it in a way where it's not trivia. It's not just like taking things and like scanning it and putting up, you know, which is great too, but like just that meaning making work. Like right now I'm involved in a street naming campaign in downtown Berkeley where we're trying to name a street after one of the first South Asian women on the West Coast. And she and her husband and her kids are trying to move to a specific neighborhood of Berkeley, and they were not allowed to move in by white neighbors. And we're super excited to be able to like try to name like a 2-block street after her, to be like, welcome home. It's been 100 years. Like you've had a complicated relationship with the city. The city is for everybody. And that happened because the South Asian American Digital Archive, they did a lot of work on like preserving that collection and putting that story out into the world so we can kind of like take that as community-based activists. So I love these collections that are, you know, OCR and we can search, but then we really need like community-based like archiving and knowledge production and just like our archivists.
Yeah, that really makes me think of this, another really interesting thing to me about so many of your projects is this almost kind of like tension between sifting through these existing collections and finding this amazing stuff which tells these incredible stories which was never the intention of those initial collections, you know, these projects to like, oh, we're just going to digitize every single newspaper. And it's really nice that that's broad, but it doesn't really like inform, you know, it's not directed towards the specific community that's at issue here. And the tension between that and the much more specifically directed community archives, you know, archives which are very much coming from the community and which are collecting documentation of a community. And I also think, as you kind of hinted towards, Anirvan, are often doing that in a slightly more, a way that involves more care, that entails a little bit more care. And I just think it's, I don't know, it's such an interesting question, especially for all of y'all's work that has really collected a lot of things from those other collections and is also simultaneously, you know, doing that care work as well, that much more careful, community-driven collecting. And it makes me think further about like, if you want to delve into this, like what's the repatriation plan for, like, I don't know, some of those collections that are, you know, in huge institutions, and maybe they almost more belong in these more community-driven collections. A large question, but I mean, I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, KJ, just because the DTA has such an incredible breadth of things that are kind of like taken from other institutions and consolidated in this one place, and also things that really live, you know, are in the DTA.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that, actually. In some ways, I think digital archives allow us to do both and, right? Because it allows us to have these thematic collections, or these more targeted and specific sites that draw in certain types of researchers, right? But then also you can have it easily be interoperable and harvested by broader collections. So all of our materials are available through Digital Commonwealth, which is the Massachusetts-based state repository, which then goes into DPLA, right? So people are finding trans-related materials through all of those channels, as well as through some of our hosting institutions, right? So a big part of my work is thinking about it not just in the silo of the DTA, but how other people are going to find it and encounter it through these other broader collections. Because of course, the last thing that we want to do is take all of our history and isolate it, right? Is put it over here and not encourage really wide and varied use of that. But what's been fascinating is that as I've been working to collect these materials, it is, as you were mentioning, Charlie, a lot of education, right? Where you're working with archivists to go through collections and say, actually, that does have a lot of relevance for trans history. You may not have realized it, or that may not be described in a finding aid, but let's work on that finding aid so we can make that collection more legible to researchers who might find it really interesting. And I think that, you know, we're just continuing to see more and more archivists who are sharing our passion for this work. And so it's making that all the more easy, you know. So in the beginning, when I started this project, I had to do a lot of cold calling, a lot of like showing up at archives and saying, hey, let's dig through stuff together, and really trying to do a lot of work to enlist archivists to share my enthusiasm. And now mostly I get emails from archivists who say, how can we get materials up on your site, which is fantastic. But the other part of it I would say too is that I spend a lot of time talking to trans elders and really trying to do educational work about how important these materials are, and saying like, please don't throw these things out. You know, like I can work with you to facilitate a long-term home in a physical repository for these materials, irrespective of whether they get digitized to a great extent for the DTA. But I think a lot of the work that digital archives can help to do is actually to reinforce the importance of physical collections that are alongside digital collections, which are always only a small fraction of the physical holdings, and really just continue to educate our communities about how much we need to keep collecting this, because we have to keep telling our own stories, and we have to keep providing those resources for our communities and for our broader educational and political goals that go far beyond our communities.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
Charlie, can you repeat the question for me? I just want to say, KJ, that was a beautiful explanation, but if you could go ahead and run that back for me real quick.
Oh yeah, no problem. I was just, I'm just really interested in this tension between kind of curating all this stuff that exists in other collections, you know, in institutions, in private individuals' collections sometimes and stuff, and also collecting yourself, like pulling the stuff out of larger institutions and then representing it for a specific community, and then as opposed to collecting like deeply within that community, and having that collection be really for that community and intended to serve that community, and in some cases really serve that community only and not serve anyone else, you know, like that was why I mentioned, you know, this interesting question of repatriation. Like, are there ever any things, I wonder, that, you know, don't belong in the larger institutions and should almost have a permanent home with, like, in this case, Black Lesbian Archives, for example?
Definitely. One thing that I didn't mention when I was just talking about like my backstory, when I did start off the Black Lesbian Archives, that was something that was really big for me, like looking and trying to find like our history. And I think Claire mentioned this, or I think Claire might have mentioned this, or like going on Google, you know what I'm saying? And like trying to find this history, and then realizing, especially after doing it for so long, like information was like slowly starting to get, you know, knocked off the internet. And I'm gonna get into that too. I want to get into the internet too. I won't go on a long spiel, but I'm definitely gonna get into the internet. And then also going into institutions or places that, you know, collect only a certain amount of archives, or for the most cases that I've seen, just like magazines, because magazines or publications or zines or whatever you want to call it was real big, especially back in the day. And realizing, well, damn, like if, you know, what are we collecting for ourselves, you know, and then even finding out that a lot of the stories are things that might have been donated or given away to different collections departments were never documented. They never took the time to actually go over them, look over them, and then process them and make them available to the public. So it kind of goes to show, like, if we're talking about digital collections versus physical collections, it's like, yeah, I want to put, you know, things on the internet, and people ask me all the time, could you put more digital stuff? And I'm like, yeah, I could, but there's something really sacred about physical archives. And I know we're in the Saturn Aquarius, we're about to be going into Age of Aquarius. I know technology is like, it's crazy right now, and it's a very digital based world we're living in. And I get that, but it's one thing to actually be able to sit with the material than to, you know, because we live in such a like scroll based world where people have like attention spans of like an ant, you know what I mean? And they don't actually get to sit with the information. But I do understand also with the digital archives, you know, for just accessibility, because not everybody, especially in the time we're living in now, can just fly to a certain place. So for me, I've definitely been in a space of where I'm like, well, let's get an actual building. Let's get a physical building where people can actually come to, not only online, but come to actually learn about what archiving is, and not even just what we're going into, but the history of archives, the tools that we use, the gloves that we use, the boxes, you know, just all aspects that they possibly can. And then we can kind of come together and collaborate how we want to move forward with just passing that torch over. And I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to pass it to the next. Oops. Oh, hold on a second. My bad. Okay, I'm back. I just want to say this. Don't call me on it, but I just want to say this. I've been watching a lot of documentaries about the internet. The last documentary that I watched was a documentary called What the Internet? And it talks about the patents, and it talks about like the fact that we have no control over the internet system. Like we have zero. If they wanted to shut the internet down tomorrow, they could. And so, especially when I'm talking about Black lesbians, or just talking about our community, and we're talking about accessibility, or even in some countries, might I add, that there's people that actually have to pay to get internet. Like not just like a monthly subscription, but like you pay your monthly subscription, but then you have to pay an extra, you know, $5.99 or $6.99 just to get into a site. And the way things are moving right now, and especially we're like in a galactic technology war where we all have cameras and we can all kind of expose our truths in a sense. It's not to say that people wouldn't be able to like just shut that down with like ease. So I think about that too when we're building physical systems and digital systems at the same time, because the physical systems we can copy. We can distribute, you know what I'm saying, worldwide if we wanted to. You know, I get it. There's, you know, risk with, you know, physical archives and things like that, but you can easily distribute those things at hand. Digital archiving, you can do that in a sense, but at the same time, you really have to go back to copies anyway, because if they shut it down, you don't have access anymore. And I think we kind of talked about this too, the last conversation we had with us, but like the TikToks and the Vines, and like it's easy for them to shut it down. You know what I'm saying? So I just want everybody to kind of keep that in mind. I'm pretty sure y'all have already thought about some of these things, but just keep that in mind when building in the future of like the internet. Is a privilege for us right now. So just, just definitely keep that in mind. And, I, at this point in time with the BLA, am just trying to get as much information as I can about the back end stuff, so I can actually give that information to my community, and then just try to show them how important it is that we do, like KJ said too, is like preserving those stories, and making them accessible and available to the people that really have an interest and want to get to know where they come from. You know what I mean? So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, Crew, I really liked how you brought back to our discussion we had last week involving the frailty of individual formats, technologies, and platforms, and the totally transformed landscape that's going to be archives in 20 years. If the climate apocalypse doesn't kill us all. But Nirvan talked about half the trust earlier, and I think that's one example of a high quality, but more high throughput kind of archive, where almost everything is OCR. That can be, which means that you can basically search through anything with plain text, which is amazing. But there will never be a time ever where digital archives replace physical archives. You cannot have a digital archive without physical archives. It's impossible. Even the Internet Archive has a physical space where it resides. And back in the day when I used to work at my first hospital job, we had this kind of saying, which I'm sure was stolen from something else, that if something digital doesn't exist in at least 3 places, then it doesn't exist. It might as well just be gone. And I do think about, for instance, I got really into identifying queer lives from the early 20th century, including Ralph Werther / Jenny June. And one of the things that was interesting was that some archives threw out the copies of the books because they were in other archives. And in one case, I asked somebody for a scan of one, and they were like, "Why do you want that? It's already scanned in the Internet Archive. We're actually thinking about getting rid of this copy." And that copy had the author's handwriting on the first page, which may be used for handwriting identification in the near future to kind of open up who this person was and what their life was like. And that was almost thrown out. So it makes you wonder how much was thrown out if that was just barely caught. And so, having essentially advanced search engines like the Digital Transgender Archive are so important. But in terms of repatriation, that's a really interesting question, Charlie, because who owns the materials is even if you're focused more on museums, obviously cultures that have created those objects have a right to those objects. The British Museum should give back almost all of its collection, honestly. But when it comes to archives, it's kind of a weird in-between, because it's so hard to say who owns it, and some of these institutions might have members from those communities and some of them might not, or might at different times. And even smaller communities, I mean, heck, even Stonewall is having a hard time paying its bills. And so having dedicated physical spaces for LGBTQ stuff is really difficult, raising the funds. And so sometimes relying on these larger institutions is more of a necessity than anything else. And I don't think it's necessarily bad, but when they're oh, we can shut this down tomorrow, like you were talking about earlier, then we get into some problems, because once something is lost, you can't regain it. But if a building is lost, you can rebuild it. If a digital archive is lost, you can keep the files on your computer, and if the internet becomes reavailable, you can throw it right back up. But once an actual object itself or anything in the archive is gone, it's gone. And that's something, I mean, everybody here has worked on preservation in some sense or another, and it's so important.
I've been doing a lot of work on pre-1920 materials recently, and it's interesting, just the idea that these are materials that have survived a century. and they were like ephemera. Like nobody actually like thought that somebody 100 years from now would like hear about like a phone book. Well, not literally a phone book, more like a city directory, or just like so many different kinds of sources. And I mean, crude. Like I mean, I can really keep thinking about like these materials that we're creating today. Like, are they, like you're talking about TikTok, like, are they going to survive a year, 5 years, 10 years? Just the idea that like you can be doing cultural production today or like photographs or whatever else, and it's going to like last, like somebody in 2120 can like discover their histories. Like, what will it take? Because I was recently involved in backing up a lot of Yahoo groups. So I think all of us probably know, but like Yahoo groups, whereas it was before Google groups, it was just a really popular like place where you can like have mailing lists, super popular in the 2000s. So a lot of like South Asian and related histories is on there in the same way that like all histories are on there. And I was able to work with people from like the Resilience Archives and South Asian American Digital Archives and others to like back up a lot of queer, QTAPI, South Asian American like groups off that. And that's amazing, but it shouldn't take the fact that like some archivist knows a techie who knows how to like download materials before they get deleted. It just feels so fragile. And every single time I'm like, I couldn't back up that group. Like I feel this kind of like physical pain. And yet when you pull it out, I mean, Charlie, I was telling you about this moment when like I discovered this like Sikh youth organizing mailing list from like the early 2000s. And so I get all this and I'm thinking a lot of like just that process of like saving our histories and making them available, OCR, like all the different public access points. So I have like this big, like, like big archive of old emails in this mailing list. And I'm like, where do I even begin? So I start searching for emails sent on South Asian American Yahoo groups, like in the first 2 weeks after 9/11. And there were like attacks against people who were like Muslim, Arab, South Asian, or perceived as such in those weeks. And about a week or so after 9/11, like I find this like mailing list email from like, I want to say maybe like 6 students at UCLA. And they're like, we came up with like some great new talking points for the Sikh community where they're like, number one, we want people to know who we are. Number two, do not throw Muslims under the bus. People are attacking us, perceiving that we're Muslim. And just the idea that they only have 2 talking points and one of those talking points are like, stand with Muslim communities, instead of like distinguishing us, like focusing only on distinguishing from Muslim communities. That's a story that I knew at that time doing South Asian American activism of Sikhs standing with Muslims instead of like separating themselves. But it's something that's just like trapped in memory. And to like see that email, because I ran a search in the first 2 weeks after 9/11, I mean, I just got emotional. I didn't think that like some digital record would make me emotional. But these stories are trapped in there, and we need to figure out how to like, how somebody 100 years from now can like have that same kind of emotional experience.
Yeah, I really think, I mean, as a digital archivist, I find myself thinking a lot about, I think of it as almost like how brittle all these digital materials are, like one error and they just totally are not usable anymore. As opposed to like piece of paper, you could even tear off like a quarter of it and you might be able to still figure out what it says. And I'm kind of curious if y'all think of it this way, but I almost sort of feel like almost all of your projects actually do a little bit of work to remove some of that brittleness of digital materials and actually kind of like make things a little bit more pliable again. Kind of like store them in different places, collect them here, collect them there. I guess I'm curious, does anyone think of their projects in that way?
Oh yeah, I think that you have to. I forgot who said it, but like you gotta have information in multiple places because it's like at a zip of a, you know what I mean, at a thumb. If it's not there, then it's literally just is gone. I think Arnavan, I think he said it. Was just like the Yahoo search, like, you know what I mean? Like that information is no longer available to the people. So I think just thinking about distribution and like having multiple, sources instead of just having like one sole person, but just having like, okay, you get, material, you get material, you know what I mean? Just putting them in different places so people can continue to kind of pass that along to the next gen, or, to a friend or whatever. I definitely think you should definitely have that, open to people.
I think I'm just appreciating that as an affordance, I guess, of digital stuff, is like, yeah, spread it around. You can pass it on to here, pass it on to there, and it can be in multiple archives at the same time.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about with brittleness is like something that, yes, digital items have almost like a planned obsolescence to them. Like, it's an MP4 now, it'll be an MP5, then it'll be an MP10. Like, it was an MP1 back in the day, and you can't read the MP1s anymore. But I mean, like, when you look at like some things that the Internet Archive are doing, where they take so many different formats that are not digital, but can no longer be read because the devices that were made to read them no longer exist. Like, the last time I was there a couple years ago, they were doing the really big records back before 78s were standardized. And those records were sometimes upwards of 7 feet, and they would have a whole multi-hour symphony on them. And they were like, oh no, well, the record player for this no longer exists. And so they had to build one from schematics from like the late 1800s. And so like, the thing is that brittleness does exist. There was a chance that if they built that and tried to read it, it would destroy the record. And so it was this trade-off of, do we keep it not telling its story? In the same way of like when you're storing microforms or newsreels, those are also brittle, but digital has the advantage of, once again, like other people have said, you can copy it a lot. And ultimately, if one person in one place happened to save it, then you might be good in the future. So like, for instance, the original version of Microsoft Word was thought to be entirely lost up until like 3 or 4 years ago, when it was discovered on an employee's like hard drive from 25 years ago. And now it's been restored. Now it's online on like one of the software repositories. I think it's the Computer Archive that has it, or the Software Archive. And it's been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. So now it will definitely never be lost, as long as the format can still be read. And so, there are some trade-offs with digital, but ultimately I do think it's a good idea to have both available when you can.
It actually makes me think a little bit of language too, in relationship to how you are describing materials that have been collected or that are part of a collection, or even just how folks are describing themselves. And that's one thing that I've really been taken with everyone's project, and spending some more time digging around DTA, for example. Like, I mean, I'm sure this isn't new to you, KJ, but it's just so beautiful the way all this care is taken with the way that language is used to describe, the umbrella of transness, but also like specifically transgender folks, and similar with your work, Claire, in GSSO, the gender, sex, and sexual orientation ontology. And I feel like there's kind of this beauty that that all of y'all, but I've really seen it here with you, Claire, and you, KJ, this beauty of somehow managing to like really be quite exact, but also be really expansive. And especially in a digital structure, like something so specific as an ontology or like a controlled vocabulary, to be able to like really start to categorize and be clear about relationships, but not to enclose things and shut things off, and to instead allow for expansion. And I wonder if people could talk a little bit about that.
I'm glad it looks beautiful from your side of things. I think Claire and I will probably both share a similar answer in that it's probably the parts of the project and the projects that I work on that keeps me up at night most, right? Is accurate and ethical representation of the people who are in these collections through our controlled vocabularies. I know that's a really geeky admission that I just made about what I'm thinking about in the middle of the night. But part of what inspired me to work so much on the Homosaurus, which was a resource that has been around for decades and has been rejuvenated a few different times, but most recently into a linked data vocabulary. And Claire and I are on the board for the Homosaurus, and you can find it at homosaurus.org. And that our version of it is still, we're constantly finding so many things that need to be fixed and added and amended. But there is real commitment on the basis of queer information professionals to really push these conversations forward and to help other information professionals to like start doing a better job of describing queer related resources. And so things like the Homosaurus help to do that because it's a more community-based, more nimble, more responsive subject term vocabulary that can address some of the gaps in Library of Congress subject headings, for example, and really try to do a better job at making these resources discoverable. But of course, as someone who processes materials all the time, and Crew might be able to speak to this too, like it's really hard to do that accurately and to make sure that you are being authentic to the subjects who are represented in the objects that you're describing and trying to make discoverable. And one of our policies, for example, is that we don't actually put labels or terms on people, especially when we don't know how they self-identify, right? So we try to take everything that's in the resource, but if we have a photograph, right, and there's several people of color in the photograph, and there's people who look like they're transgressing gender norms and all these other things, right? How do we describe that in a way that's both accurate and ethical? I mean, we will spend sometimes an hour on a single photograph and be like, I don't know how this person self-identifies in any of these ways. So I can't just like throw a term on there. And because we're a global collection, it's not as if you can just say people of color, because that doesn't necessarily make sense within a global context. And you can't necessarily say transgender because people on the other end will start interpreting that as a transgender person when that person may not identify as transgender, right? So there's just all these complexities about how the metadata comes to represent the objects, when for those of us who are describing it often, at least I'll speak for myself, I'm just trying to help people to find it, and then I want them to do more work in sorting out what is happening in that resource and how to make meaning of that.
Yeah, KJ, I think in a lot of ways, like when you put together an archive of any kind, like you're going to have a ton of metadata, an overwhelming amount of metadata. In a lot of cases, you might end up with more metadata than the actual data. And obviously we're gonna be wrong a lot. Terms are gonna be completely different in 20 years and 40 years and 100 years and 200 years. And when you look back at a document from 150 years ago, I mean, I see this problem all the time where I'll meet a lesbian, gay, or bisexual historian, and they'll be like, I'm so, I don't know if this person was trans or not trans. And then I'm like, okay, well, like, what about Oscar Wilde? And they're like, oh yeah, he was gay, he was bisexual. And I was like, well, bisexual didn't come to its modern meaning until like the 1930s, and he was dead. And gay, he never identified as gay, like ever. And so why do you feel okay with using those words, but not okay with using transgender? And we end up with all these like border cases, and, different communities want to claim different things. Queer people in general can't even, come to an idea of the acronym that's appropriate, and whether or not, if you have a society that is GLBT or LGBT or LGBTQ or LGBTQIA, it's a toss-up. Are they going to include asexual material? Are they going to include intersex material? Are they going to include two-spirit material? I see labels like LGBTQ Native Americans that include two-spirit. Is that accurate? Does that reflect that experience within those communities? And ultimately, like, oftentimes these nuances are so overwhelming that having something that is flawed that hopefully somebody will correct is preferable than not having anything at all. And yeah, I mean, a good vocabulary, a good archive should be a living like document, a living collection where things are changing and shifting and updating. And with the times, you know, you might have the original finding aid, but it might link to the future current terminology. If something says female impersonator and it was categorized in the 80s, and somebody who's searching drag queens, you know, you might want to link back in some sense. And yeah, it's it's a difficult situation. And I mean, like, you know, Christine Jorgensen was written about as a transvestite for like a large portion of her life, but she identified as transgender before she died. So like, you know, these identities shift too. You have plenty of trans men who identified as butch lesbians. You have plenty of, you know, trans masculine people who decided that that wasn't what they wanted to be and detransitioned and identified as butch lesbians. And so when you pick somebody like randomly out of the 1800s and you're like, okay, what do we think? I mean, you're going to be wrong. And, you know, these should be, you know, questions that come up, and we should be more okay with transgressing our own boundaries. Like, as much as queer people, we want to say that we're not enforcing binaries, we're not enforcing norms, and then we turn around and we enforce them. And it's a difficult process to mitigate for sure. Sorry, that was a really long rant. I just have a lot of feelings.
I actually wondered, Crew, I've heard some really interesting interviews where you've talked about your decision to like, you know, keep it specific to Black lesbian archives. Like, I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about that in this context.
Oh, most def. Now, definitely, I feel like is really important given our history. When I first started out the Black lesbian archives, I mean, I do have the Black lesbian archives, and then I also have queer Black creatives, right? So I'll talk a little bit about queer Black creatives moving forward. But I went to Imani, and I remember I was just like, I don't know, you know, I knew that I wanted to do a project, you know, talking about who I was as a Black lesbian, but then I was like, well, I know people from all walks of life, you know what I'm saying? So I was like torn. I was like, should I call it the Black queer archives, you know, for women, or should I call it the Black lesbian archives? And for me, the term queer, as I've come to know it, I probably stumbled on that word of like, not necessarily me, but just self-identifying as a collective whole community, like the broader scale of community, probably like around the time I got to college. And I was like, oh snap, like what I knew when it came out, as I did research on history, it came out like around the 90s, around that time. But it was, for us, it was kind of like the umbrella term for the entire community scope. That's what I've learned it to be. So going into like my own history and coming out as a Black lesbian, I wanted to make sure that it was very specific when we're talking about like our history. So when somebody's actually looking for those stories, when somebody's actually looking for something to relate to, they can go back and see that. You know, it's not necessarily all just like, wait, what? You know, it's like, it's not necessarily all jumbled up into just one thing, you know, because people do, everybody I've come to know doesn't necessarily identify as queer. And there's some people who don't necessarily identify as lesbian, and that's okay, you know, but the information or the material that I am searching for is specifically for Black people who are Black lesbians. So when people come to me about what they want to give over, it's very cut and dry. It's like, I'm a Black lesbian, or, you know, I was a part of this Black lesbian organization or this Black lesbian community, and I want to give this over to you. And it's very specific, you know, but once again, people change, terms change, things change. So maybe at one point in time, I've even had, when I was doing the first exhibit, I had this big old poster, this big painting of somebody who was in the community who self-identified actually as a Black lesbian at first. but then later on they came out as trans. So they was like, oh, you know, that person necessarily doesn't identify as a Black lesbian, they're actually trans. And I was like, oh, well, let me, you know what I mean? Well, this is actually who is, you know what I mean? Instead of, so, you know, you just, you know, like Claire said, you kind of just have to flow with it, but especially for Black lesbians in general and just the history that we've had, you know, throughout the history of time going back, you know, those were the terms that we come into, and the work that I do, even though it's very present in my life and for the women who identify as that, or are that, or be that, I also acknowledge the fact that my elders, my ancestors, and I call it my furry and lesbian godmothers, you know, that's where they've come from. That's what they've come to know to be true. So I still embrace that, you know, when I am talking about history, and also embrace the new shit too. So, you know what I mean? Definitely.
All these questions about language too, I think are really, they start to inform a really great question that we have in the chat from Kimberly. So I thought we could bring that in now, and that is, if any of you have any tools or tips to pass on to graduates and or undergraduates who are starting to kind of try to go through this process of uncovering or recovering queer narratives that might be spread across all kinds of archives, and how you've done that in your own work.
I feel like Anirban should probably take this one first, because I feel like he's done like this incredible amount of work to really recover some queer narratives that are being otherwise excluded or forgotten. Sorry to put you on the spot if you don't mind.
No, I'm a huge fan, and like a lot of our work just builds on the work of like other academics and kind of more formal historians, community-based historians. So for the looking at like early pre-1930 histories of South Asian queer folks in California. So I'm definitely indebted a lot to Nayan Shah, who I believe is at USC, who's really been recovering a lot of the kind of 1910s histories of MSM folks. And there's something really interesting there about even just kind of going back in time to using that language. Like there's there's so many different ways that like gender deviance and criminalized gender deviance has been used. And like I spent a lot of time just looking at like old law books and old history books just to try to like understand like how people were categorized. And then once you see it, then it's like, okay, well, now I know. And again, OCR is such a blessing. I mean, I feel like half my work is going into an archive that was never designed to be searched a particular way, and try searching for like 25 different things and maybe something will come up. Yeah, like for me, the only tip, if anything, that I have is just try a lot of things. I want to say like maybe a few months ago, I discovered that the Berkeley City Council, they have city council records going back like 100 years. So I started searching for like alternative terms like Hindu with 2 O's and Oriental and like Jap, and just these like really terrible terms that we would never use today. But it's great, you know, like there's all these like histories of housing discrimination, which is super depressing. And things like that I found by just like searching for these terms randomly in random places. So yeah, that's been pretty helpful. I think at this point in time, I've got like a list of like 50 keywords that I search for in every single archive that I have access to.
Charlie, can you give a real quick overview of what OCR is, just so folks know what that means in case that language isn't familiar?
That is a great question. So OCR stands for Optical Character Recognition, and it is there's all kinds of different softwares that do it, like specific computer programs, but it is it's a type of computer program that basically reads images of text and then transcribes that text into actual computer text that you could search on your computer by using Control F or something like that. And I actually, it made me think of so many other things that that amazing answer that Anirban just gave. But before I jump into that, I just want to check if anyone else has any thing to say in regards to this question of uncovering or recovering queer narratives that might be spread across all kinds of disparate archives.
I would definitely just a quick tip. I would definitely say once you do start, getting into that research and you are, just kind of getting into specific of where you want to be, talk to the people. If you have, let's just say, for example, you start, doing research and some names start popping up, like look into those people specifically and reach out to those people, because the internet definitely can give you some like context, some back end context of what's going on. But until you actually have that sit down conversation with the person who was a part of that community or a part of that organization or a part of those, whatever was going on at that time, it'll give you like a kind of like a visual, I kind of picture it for me as like a movie, like, they telling me the story and I'm like, in my mind, I'm like picturing the movie of like what happened at that given time. And it kind of just creates this whole story of, given that from their own visual perspective of what was going on. So definitely, when you do start digging, just be direct. Go try if you can. Not to say that, because if it's like, the 1800s, it's a little different. But, especially if it's like in this current time where those people are still living, definitely go talk to the people.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add to that is somewhat similar in that I would say not to trust digital interfaces and not to trust OCR fully, right? It's good to have a healthy skepticism and to keep asking questions. So even when you come across metadata or information about a resource, don't always trust it, right? Because often it's done either through automated computing or through people, both of which make errors. And so, what makes a good researcher is often refusing to just accept what you see in front of you at face value and just keep quite, like, all right, let's pull on that thread. Let's go talk to that person. Let's go see what else this is connected to, and just trying to like triangulate the histories so you're getting a much more complete picture rather than a single resource can provide you with.
One thing that I also have to admit, really, your response kind of made my mind go towards Anirvan is how I always, like, I love OCR so much and yet I hate OCR so much, because for me it's like the perfect example of just like what technology is coming from a place that they don't need to come from. So when I'm like, as archives and especially digital archives, I think we all, even if we're not aware of it, do a lot of relying on OCR, optical character recognition, which was a technology developed by the military for military uses. And so I just think it really gets into this like interesting question that Crew really brought up like initially, that I find myself thinking about a lot, almost like the actual infrastructures that we're all relying on for these projects. And I mean, even down to, like Crew said, the internet and, the cables and the servers that runs them, and whose land is those servers on, and whose land is being destroyed so that, fossil fuels can power those servers and stuff like that. And one thing that I've really enjoyed about like all of our conversations as we have led up to this panel is the way in which I think that actually almost all of y'all have really brought that up and continue to come back to that. And I wondered if people could just talk about that a little more, because I really love that. Or I don't love that, I hate it, but I love that it's present, that it's here in people's minds, that it's like here in all of y'all's minds, or at least it has been when we've talked about it.
I mean, technology is never neutral. I think the big lesson here is no matter what you do, you're kind of screwed. I mean, there are always going to be, well, as it currently stands, there are these larger organizations and pieces and players. And I mean, you can always try to be as ethical as physically possible, but like by living in the United States and being a US citizen, you are contributing in some part to a system that is, making lives horrible for hundreds of thousands of people So, like, does that mean that I should give up my citizenship tomorrow and be stateless? Like, is that reasonable? Probably not. And so you have to take these like very, well thought out steps. I do agree that like a lot of people don't think enough about the things they're using before they use them. But I do think that like, shooting yourself in your foot, trying to be as, like if you go to the grocery store, right, and there are, unfortunately, the way capitalism works, we have 100 different types of toothpaste you can choose. If you sit down and you go through every single company, like it's not something that's reasonable with every choice in your life. And so you have to make these choices. And I guess, if you're using a database platform, for instance, you should try to pick something that's open source. You should try to pick something that's community driven rather than, a big company like cough, cough, Microsoft. But like, there are always going to be times when you're like, I really need this. And is the good going to outweigh the bad? I hate to be like, the greater good, because that's a bad ideology. But I mean, be aware of, be aware of politics no matter what you're doing. Realize that nothing in life is apolitical, and that you need to, make those choices of platforms as ethically as possible, given your current space and ability. If you're in a small town and you don't have a car and the only grocery store that's available is owned by an evil corporation, your choices are starve or don't go. I mean, and then it's a hyperbole, but with archives, sometimes, you don't have the funds to choose the more expensive community-driven resource that's more ethical. And, that is unfortunately, in my opinion, one of the consequences of capitalism in general, is that you're always going to be forced to make these decisions. But like, if it was something that was created, with, slave labor abroad, like, you should keep that in mind. And I think, the world would be better off if more people actually diligently researched the platforms they used. But also, don't beat yourself up over it every second of every day. And rant.
I did want to jump in on that. I love your personality, Claire. Like you be having me dying over here. No, I definitely wholeheartedly agree. I definitely struggle with that. And once again, I'm gonna come back to like Saturn and Aquarius generation. I'm a 92 baby, so I'm like, F the system. You know what I mean? Like there's a part of me that can be very rebellious when it comes to certain things and certain infrastructures. And I do, especially as I'm, getting older and just learning more about the stuff that I do and just the world in general. I'm learning sometimes you do have to take, the good with the bad and kind of work with those things until you kind of, get into a groove. But I'm also in my mind, I've been having like, on a lightweight, like prophet, like, just these dreams or these visions of like what the world could be. And I think, looking at these archives and just looking at history in general, from the ancient Egyptians on, to where I am now, just me personally, I'm like, well, we keep going through these cycles of the same thing, but and we're progressing. Like, I'm not saying that we haven't made no moves. Like, okay, ancestors, like we've definitely made moves like as we went through, but do we have to keep living through these same cycles? Do we have to keep low-key submitting to the powers that be to, live in this world? So in my mind, I'm thinking like, damn, like how can we push the narrative? We're pushing the narratives within our own communities. How can we push the narratives, to push things forward to where we do have independent communities and we do have, tribes and villages of us, that we're coming together and we're building something for ourselves. You know, I've seen a lot of, you know, banter back and forth. And don't get me wrong, hey, change it, do it, you know, fighting back and forth with the system about the things that they're not doing for us. But I'm like, y'all downplaying our genius. Like we're literally downplaying our genius. Like you thought that we were supposed to come to this particular realm, this particular world to serve the people that aren't serving us back. Like that's a slap in the fucking ancestors. Sorry, that's a slap. My ancestors coming out. Hold on. That's a slap in the face. That's a slap in the face to the people that have walked before us and that have done the work to really try to bridge these things together. So I say that to say, like, let's start thinking beyond that. And me and Charles have been talking about this. Me and Lee have been talking about this. And I've been having conversations, individual conversations with people of like, okay, if we're talking about internet systems, there's people out here who are building their own internet systems, like literally open source internet systems to where it is available to the people. You know, we do have access and we can still communicate with each other, but also, and we're talking about pipelines and building on lands, and we also have nature. You know, we also have like going back to like nature home and being able to connect on that level, but also using, I guess to say, integrating technology in a way where we don't have to necessarily pull all the way from technology, but we have to get back to our core nature of where we come from and who we are, and know that we don't have to live in a world where we're quote unquote following the rules of these said people who sit up in their nest while they're looking down at us like, yeah, that's what I said, do it. You know what I mean? We don't have to do that. We ain't gotta do that, you know? And I'm gonna be fighting to the day I die till we can really flip shit around, because I don't feel like we don't have to stay in that. We can break that, you know. And I know it's gonna take work. I know it's not gonna happen overnight. You know, I know it's gonna be a slow and steady process, but we gotta, I'm not trying to preach right now, but we really have to believe that it, you know what I mean? Like we have to believe it can happen. Like I see it. I see us living in, and this is not gonna be a rant, but I just see us living in a world where we're equal in a sense of like, we're not asking to be equal. We just like, yeah, that's my homie. Like, you know what I mean? Like, my bad, my battery getting kind of low, but you know, like we're exchanging goods, we're exchanging knowledge, we're healthcare systems, we're holistic, we're healing each other, you know, through the things that we have in our homes. We're you know what I mean? We're feeding to each other and not sucking each other dry. You feel what I'm saying? So that's just a little something. Like I totally agree with you. And then just also keeping that in mind of like, we do have the power. We hold the archives, y'all. Like, come on now. Like we're holding the stories. That's just a step in the larger, you know, world that we live in right now. So I definitely want y'all to keep that in mind as we're moving, especially through the rest of 2020, because it's about to get very real. And as we move into these new years of like, yeah, nah, like we're in a window, we're in this portal, we're in this window of where we can quote unquote go back to normal, which we never will, or we can take this opportunity like we're having these conversations now and then putting those things into action to build something that we can actually grow in and be in, that progresses us forward, you know, so the next generation can come in and be like, yeah, we got it, you know what I mean? Like we gonna keep it moving. So definitely, most definitely.
I just want to take a minute to say that if anyone in the audience has questions, it'd be an awesome time to start dropping them in to the question, the Q&A box, or if anyone on Facebook Live has any questions, like please start dropping them in, and we want to start answering those and addressing those. And I think Lee is willing to help us transcribe some questions from Facebook Live into Zoom so we can see it. But still moving forward off that, I think one thing that maybe this is even, I think like what you were talking about, Crew, is almost even a better way for to conceptualize what really like grabs me about all this stuff. I think when you were talking about these questions of like communities taking care of themselves with, providing healthcare, providing food, etc. I wonder, like, are archives actually a part of those essential services? Are they for folks? Are folks seeing that in their own work?
I mean, ever since the beginning of like humanity, like you would have the people who would go get food, you would have the people who would provide shelter, and you would always have people who were the oral history tellers, who told the stories, who told the myths, who told the religion. Like that goes back before we even have written history. And in a way, that those are the first archives. They were like living human beings, right? And so in that sense, yes, absolutely. I don't think humans can go on without some form of storytelling as a part of our lives. It's a necessity for sure.
Yeah, Drew, I was looking at your website, and there's just something about like the work of putting stuff into archives, but getting it out, like in your case, in like physical locations. And I think that's so important, where things don't go into the archive to die, but it's connected to the public history work. It's connected to that storytelling work. It powers our movements, and I mean, it's like I think about. We were running our Berkeley South Asian Radical History walking tour when the massacre at Oak Creek happened, I think 8 years ago, in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, where somebody came and shot up a Sikh Gurdwara. Or we were on the walking tour when the Muslim ban happened, people were rushing to the airports, and we stopped the tour to talk about that. And like our work, it's not disconnected from movements, it is part of our movement work. And I think everybody here like understands that this is movement work and cultural work. But I mean, I think it's on all of us to like keep pushing that.
No, I totally agree with you. I completely agree with you. That's why I kind of mentioned like to the hieroglyphics or the Egyptians, and you know how they knocked in the hieroglyphics of like, yeah, like there were scribes, you know what I mean? And different cultures had their own, storytellers. And, I like to talk often about like how the people, especially for me, because I definitely have native blood in me too. So like, and African blood. So it's like people coming together around that fire, and being able to like share those stories and kind of do that storytelling. So, the little kids are sitting around the fire like, what's next, Papa? And then they grow, you know what I mean, and tell those histories to the next, you know what I mean. So the stories never die. And even if they didn't have that pen and pad to kind of like write those things down, which we have the resources and we do that, and they have the resources too, but I'm just saying like we have those tools to be able to do that. We can continue to keep pushing that narrative to tell those stories and pass those things on too. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
This question might be kind of, I mean, this is something that I was thinking about as I was coming up with what I thought it might be fun to talk about. And this question might be a little weird, so bear with me a little bit. But one thing that I've really been struck by from all of you is how a lot of you have really described this almost like, I mean, forgive this like sort of colonial language, but this like moment of discovery almost, of being like, oh my God, like these people of which I am a part, like that, they were here, they were doing this thing, and I didn't know about it until right now. Like, here it is, I just found it. And that has seemed, as you describe it to me, that has seemed really powerful for all of y'all. And then I just get curious in that same context, as we move forward with all these great projects that everyone's doing, with a more widely available access to the radical South Asian history of Berkeley, the various gender terms in GSSO, the transgender history that appears in Digital Transgender Archive, and the stories in Black Lesbian archives. Like, how do y'all think about that model as you think about building a new kind of, like you were saying, crew, making it almost like the fire where we can gather around and really like share those stories, but also preserving that almost like really powerful moment of discovery of like, oh my God, I didn't know these folks were here, and they are here, and I'm like so fed by knowing that there's these other people here. I guess I'm just curious if that's something that y'all think about, because I feel like all these projects do such interesting work to come up with these new models for how we collect and provide access to that cultural memory. Yeah, and if there's a worry about losing that like discovery moment, or if actually we're coming up with something totally new where that exists in a different way, you know?
Oh, I'm gonna answer real. I did do that. Actually, the first video that I put on YouTube was like, wait a minute, like I watched a documentary about lesbian bars that were leaving, you know, or shutting down and closing down. And that's really what sparked off after doing research of like, whoa, wait. Like I had that aha moment of like, wait, if the community spaces that we go to, which is specifically bars and bookstores and libraries and these places are closing down, then what do we have, you know, as far as like, you know, communing and seeing people, you know, in our community. So I think for me, I can't necessarily speak to the future and what that will look like, especially in a time like this per se. But I just think that self-documentation, especially for the work that we do, we focus a lot in on archiving or you know, just talking and speaking to other people's stories. But I feel like even for me, sometimes I have to remind myself of like, you probably need to be recording this, you know, or if it's video or through audio. That's why I have the BLA podcast, the Black Lesbian Archives podcast, because I'm like, I need to talk about this now. You know what I mean? Like I need to just offhand, you know, just talk about like how I'm feeling and what's going on, just to keep you posted. So self documentation, specifically when it comes to that, is definitely important. So yeah, definitely.
One thing I would say about that with respect to the DTA is that I almost feel that if someone has felt like we've done all the discovery work, has got to a resource and they're like, great, no, all right, well, that's already been done, then we failed, right? Because like so much of what I see as the point of the project is to instill the same passions for trans history in our users that I have, right? And those of us who get geeked out over these kinds of research projects, I mean, we get excited by the one little string, right? That you just keep pulling and pulling and pulling, and it just opens up in all these different directions. And I think that, you know, in the moments where I geek out about digital archiving, all of the interconnections that we can build through digital archives actually help that, right? So in our design features for the DTA, we try not to have many closed doors. We try not to have many dead ends where people get to one spot and then that's it, right? There's no links on that page. Instead, every page should have links to many, many other places and related topics and so forth, right? You know, the commercial sites have been doing this well for a very long time, right? You don't just want to buy one thing on Amazon, you want to buy thousands of things, right? Because they learn your buying practices, right? And I think, you know, again, let's be critical of the consumerist culture, but also, you know, there are things that those of us who are building digital archives can learn from that, right? That like there's a way of inviting people in and inviting their continued engagement. And then also, you know, thinking about Crew's work too, like inviting their contributions and ways of having them really work alongside you in a project and not necessarily just be consumers of the project, right? And so it's a way of like, of inviting people into the excitement that you have and then extending that excitement through their participation, I think is the ultimate goal of a project like the DTA.
And I think like what Crew was saying in terms of like podcasting and in YouTube and making videos and holding panels and, you know, keeping that the history alive and, you know, talking about your own oral history in relationship with that. I think also we really need, in terms of an archivist community and like a vocabulary-wide community, we need to really continue to ask questions about accessibility. Like, you know, is this something that if somebody were visually impaired, can they access this the same way as if they couldn't? And, you know, just questions like that. Sometimes as individuals, we kind of get in our own head and are like, well, I can access this well, therefore, and I know I do that, and I've made that mistake, and I've thankfully been corrected quite often, which is really good because we all make mistakes. But yeah, I do think, you know, moving forward, it's so nice to find some, like the idea, like Katie was saying, or, you know, when you find that one little nugget of like information. Like last year, I was looking in old German medical journals, and there's this, like, they go through an asylum in Paris and go through each individual person. And there was one person who was like refused to be called a man and like talked about how much they hated getting misgendered. And I was like, wait a minute, what? Like, was not expecting it at all. And I will hold on to that little kernel for years. And it's just an incredible experience. You can't replicate that. It's just, what you can discover in the archives is absolutely beautiful. And I hope, you know, that you can make that experience accessible to more people.
I think for those of us who are working on the more public side of the kind of public history work, we're really lucky because we get to see people have those aha moments like up close instead of just kind of like knowing that you're part of a much larger system, and people are hopefully having those aha moments. Like on our walking tour, for example, we do these, it's a 3-hour tour, and we always, you know, like, so we'll have like 15 people, 20 people on our tour. We storytell, we do street theater, we're showing visuals, and there's always like one person in the group who's just got this like totally like blank face. And I'm like, I'm performing here and like I have no idea whether like, you know, like it's connecting at all. And at the very end, we kind of do a share out where everybody kind of shares their favorite moment of the tour or the story that really stuck with them. And sometimes like you'll see people like have these like just those moments that you're talking about, Charlie, of their aha moments, or like just, you know, like some of us think really quickly, some of us are like taking time to kind of make those connections. And to see somebody like be like, they've been thinking and processing for 3 hours. And I feel so lucky to be able to watch people have those aha moments in real time. And part of me just wants to like take that moment and like send that back into back to the archivists who are doing that work. Because like I'm just at one end of a much larger process. And it almost feels unfair to like, you know, whatever, like to be witnessing that and not be able to share.
Oh, that's really beautiful, Anirban. I love thinking about that. Claire, do you have something to?
I'm trying to remember this website that somebody shared with me, because one, Anirban, you absolutely deserve that, and the work that you do is absolutely incredible, and I'm so glad. I'm really sorry if it's getting noisy around here with all the driving, but it made me think, somebody showed me this recently, and I don't remember the exact web address, so I apologize, but it was like mapping queer moments or something, where it was just one of those public maps where you could drop a pen and write a sentence. And it was just like LGBTQ worldwide. And I was just like, there are so many just aha moments. There's so many coming outs. There's so many like first kisses, so many like first hookups, so many first real relationships, marriages, partnerships. And it was just like, I immediately got scared. Yes, I think it's queering the map, yeah. Thank you. Or wait, I don't know if everybody can see that, but who's listening? Or is that, oh, that's all attendees, cool. But yeah, it's just, I got really happy that there were so many like collections of little moments. It didn't have to be a full book or anything. But also I got really scared because I was like, if that site goes down, and then you start reading the ones that aren't from the United States, you start reading the ones that are like, you know, from sub-Saharan Africa, Western Africa, from, you know, different parts of the Middle East, where the situation, especially right now, is not great. Not that it has not been great for a lot of people in several of those countries for a long time. Mostly as a relationship to colonialism. I don't want to make it sound like, you know, before Christianity was introduced to a lot of these places, maybe the culture was a lot different in regards to homosexuality and that sort of thing. But it's just, it's beautiful and it's scary at the same time because, you know, we don't have really a way of keeping those moments alive in a long-term sense, which, I don't know, I spend a lot of time thinking about that.
Thank you for dropping that link in, Lee. In case folks didn't see, Lee dropped the link into the chat to all the panelists and all the attendees for creating the map of the site that Claire was just talking about, which I had never seen before, and this is incredible. So thank you for that, Claire. And actually that kind of leads into what was basically sort of my final question for all of us. And actually, I have to admit, so I wanted to ask this question because I was listening to an interview with you, Crew, and it was basically just the question of like, who really inspires you, you know, who else is out there doing this work? And, you know, like, I don't even identify as a Black lesbian. And I was like, who are all these people? Like, I gotta know. And so I just thought it was so beautiful. So I wonder if folks could just say a few folks or you know, other work or other people who just have really inspired you in the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was taking me a minute to get to that mute button. Bernita Gray, her story's always gonna live on for me. She was a activist. She was so many things. Like I can't. The list will go on with Bernita Gray and just how much of a contribution she made to the Chicago community, and not even just with Black lesbians, but just in general. But one story I always share, and it'll be real quick, about how she and her friend Andrew actually created at Chicago. The name always not Chicago State. It was a university, the University of Chicago. They actually threw a party for people within the community. And at that time, it was very hush hush at that time. And they didn't think nobody was gonna come. They made a couple pizza rolls, you know what I'm saying? And they just kind of sent the flyers out, you know, throughout the neighborhoods. And they said everybody just flew through there. Like they only had like 1 or 2 parties because it got so out of hand that they had to shut it down. So just the fact that they could bring that community to the space and like take that risk, especially at a place that was kind of like side-eyeing the community, it was just beautiful to me. And also the fact that she opened her home up to everybody in the community that were kicked out of their homes at the time, you know, when people were like, you know, coming out. So definitely Bernita Gray, she will always forever live on in the archives.
I'll jump in here. I think we're all kind of stunned into silence by your question, Charlie. It's just so difficult to answer because when you start naming specific individuals, you're going to inevitably feel like people have been left out, or like, oh, 2 hours later, I should have said so-and-so, or I should have mentioned so-and-so. So I'll take a bit of a cop-out and say that for me, I've been really inspired by so many of the archival projects that have come before and that have cropped up since I started the DTA, you know, things like GLBT Historical Society, which was really a major focus in some of my early academic work. You know, other archives like the Sexual Minorities Archives, you know, like, so community-based, real on the ground, like doing the hard work of like collecting, describing, making accessible these materials, and you know, other digital archives. Anirvan, you mentioned the South Asian American Digital Archive, which is just doing this phenomenal work, right? So like finding real partners in the kinds of commitments that I am interested in making with the DTA, and continuing those kinds of collaborations. I mean, for me, those are some of my inspirations.
I know that was a tough question to answer. Sorry, everyone, but I just know y'all know so many amazing things. I want to hear about them.
I'll go really fast. I definitely want to say number 1, KJ, for sure. Was a huge influence on me before we even met, and luckily responded to my emails. Most of the people on here responded to my emails, which was great. And that's the wonderful thing about this kind of work, is that you can really make connections really quickly and easily. And then definitely Susan Stryker, who is the main reason I'm still in my grad program. I had a lot of trouble early on, and she was like, you know, buckle up, we need more trans women in academia, you're gonna do it. And lo and behold, she answered my email even though she had no idea who I was. And, you know, sometimes that makes all the difference.
For me right now, I'm thinking of the folks who published 3 different South Asian queer zines, or I guess one of them is like more like a magazine. Anamika, there were 3 issues of that came out starting in '85. Shamakami, I think there were maybe 9 issues out of like Boston and then San Francisco starting in 1990. And Tricone, which I think was founded in maybe 86 or 87 out of initially San Jose. And you know, we need stuff to archive, right? I mean, you know, like, you know, we have these like zinesters who are collecting stories, publishing materials, kind of giving us a slice of like a very specific time in a specific community. And if they weren't doing the work of capturing things in the moment, I mean, all we'd have left are just memories. So I'm really grateful for the people who are kind of capturing in real time.
Hope everyone else was as furiously scribbling as I was in my head or on the computer when that was happening. I think, oh my God, we got a cat up in here. I think we're basically at the end of the time that we had allotted for this. If there are any audience questions, please, it's not too late. Just slam them right in there and we can make it happen. But since we're only scheduled to go to 7 and we don't have any yet, I think we'll start to wrap it up here. But for everyone who attended, I just want to say thank you for coming and listening to us all talk. I mean, I had a ton of fun, so I hope everyone else did. I want to mention that this is kind of like an opening event for a workshop that Claire and I are going to be leading over the next 3 days, where we're going to learn how to program, how to use computer programming to do, you know, digital cultural heritage work, and also hopefully take those skills and then go build our own internet eventually later. It's clearly needed. So if folks are interested in that, the link to that is on the events page for this event. I believe it's currently full, but I think that and Lee also dropped the link to that in the chat. Thank you so much, Lee. I believe it's currently full, but people may drop. So if you're interested, get in touch with me or go ahead and just get on the wait list for that event. And finally, I wanted to take a minute to say, I think this Zoom meeting might automatically redirect everyone afterwards, but basically, don't forget to fill out the survey. We do want to collect information from audience members to just help us assess how well we're doing when we try to put on these grant-funded public events. So if possible, please complete that survey so that we can use that data to try to figure out how to better serve our community and other communities as well. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. If there's anything that GLBT needs to add at the last minute, holler now. If there's anything that panelists need to add at the last minute, holler now.
Just thank y'all. Like, thank
you.
y'all for sharing, you know what I mean? And just being here and just having this open conversation for sure.
And just to say, all the panelists, I hope that we can continue to talk and have these conversations, because it's really something that I want to continue to be a part of and move all this work forward. So. And once we can build our own internet, then we need a lot of help. So we need to get started. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone's time. I really appreciate all the panelists' time. And we'll see you out there in the world.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.